The Pittsburgh Steelers, again, lit the internet on fire, signed Scotty Miller, former Tampa Bay Buccaneer, former Atlanta Falcon, rejoins Arthur Smith here in Pittsburgh, along with Cordero Patterson. I mean, what's his name out of Atlanta, the tight end that I can never remember the name of. Thank you. On top of a couple of guys that have come the same way as Arthur Smith, with Arthur Smith to the Pittsburgh Steelers. But I don't think any of it matters. He's coming off of an 11-catch season. He was almost a non-factor for the Falcons last year outside of 2 touchdowns, which 2 touchdowns and 11 passes, that's not terrible. Numbers are pretty good there, but you would have liked to see a little bit more. And while the Steelers fan base, everybody in the media, everybody's talking and waiting for a big, massive wide receiver move, the Pittsburgh Steelers to solidify their room and add somebody next to George Pickens, the Pittsburgh Steelers continue to do what they've done all offseason, and that is to sign a bunch of guys that have a very minimal shot to make the 53-man roster and almost no shot to impact the Pittsburgh Steelers. You saw Scotty Miller, because I got plenty of thoughts on the Scotty Miller signing. You saw Scotty Miller's name pop up as the next addition to the Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver room, outside of the fact that he is 5'9", along with every other wide receiver in that locker room except for George Pickens and Van Jefferson. What were your thoughts?
My thoughts were just another name to add to the 4th wide receiver competition. I mean, it's Quez Watkins versus now Scotty Miller versus, Calvin Austin, I'd give a leg up to both of them, but at the same time, it's another non-impressive name and another name that, Omar Khan just wants to be able to cut as many wide receivers as possible by the time he gets to, training camp. So this is just another name that's going to say, all right, if he's better than one of these guys, sure. But at the end of the day, it's a 4th wide receiver, and I don't see him being anything more than that.
Yeah, no, I mean, fourth is generous. If we're being 100% honest, 4th is very generous. I don't see Scotty Miller making the Steelers roster. If he had punt return ability, cool. You're looking at Scotty Miller and saying this dude's a guy that is going to make some sort of impact, have some shot at making the team, because at least he could be a punt or a kick returner. Quez Watkins has that. Calvin Austin has that. Cordero Patterson has that. Scotty Miller does not have that. I think he took back 2 kicks last year. That was it. I mean, the most, I would say, underwhelming of all the underwhelming wide receiver signings this offseason, Scotty Miller tops that list. There's almost no shot that this guy makes the roster unless he comes out here and does something crazy, but I have a hard time believing that he's going to come out here and do something crazy. I don't understand where the Steelers' mindset is, because if you're looking for guys to compete for the bottom of the roster and potentially just be really good practice squad guys, you have a bunch of them. You have Marquez Callaway out of the Saints. You have Des Fitzpatrick, who spent last season in Pittsburgh and even made the roster at one point. You have Denzel Mims. Like, you have a bunch of guys who could fill your bottom of the depth chart practice squad spots and feel pretty good about it. There's no need to bring in another one. And how many slot guys can the Pittsburgh Steelers possibly need for a quarterback? Because if you want to talk about alarming things, Russell Wilson has a reputation of not utilizing the middle of the field. And I get it. The Steelers are going to look at it and say, yeah, that's not going to happen here in Pittsburgh. We're going to try our hardest to make sure that he does utilize the middle of the field. But if he doesn't, the Steelers are looking at a group of wide receivers that is the complete opposite of Russell Wilson's skill set. That is not something that you should be non-concerned with, because you should be very concerned with. Of all the good things that Omar Khan has done this offseason, his work in the wide receiver room has been the complete opposite of that. It's been like drastically concerning. That if you break it all down and you go, man, dude, he had a phenomenal draft. This is a second phenomenal draft. Phenomenal free agency. Omar Khan is killing it. That made a move with Deontay Johnson. And even then, like, I like Dante Jackson, and I think that if you got rid of Deontay because you were worried that he was going to hold out, then that makes a fair trade, and I think that works out. But since then, and I don't think that you need to have a plan in place when you trade Deontay. I think it was so early in the offseason that you could have just said, yeah, this is going to work out because we have so many options. Since then, the lack of execution on any option has brought major concern for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And there's a really good question here, because I've had this asked to me a number of times. Does Scotty Miller maybe just fit Arthur Smith's offense? I think Scotty Miller does fit Arthur Smith's offense, but I don't think he fits it any better than Calvin Austin or Quez Watkins. And I think both of those guys are already here. So why do you need a Scotty Miller? If you didn't have a Calvin Austin, you would need a Quez Watkins. If you didn't have a Quez Watkins, you would need a Scotty Miller. You have both of those guys. You don't need either of the other two. It just doesn't make much sense at all. Do you think that this is the end? Do you think that Scotty Miller was the finishing touch? This is it. Here we go. It's George Pickens and a bunch of number 4s, and then Roman Wilson, whatever he turns into, which you got to be excited about it, but still. Do you think the Steelers are done?
I think there's still a chance they're looking for something else. Again, I don't know if they trust Van Jefferson to be that outside guy that's going to be a starter for this team. I think when you look at what Scotty Miller and Quez Watkins are, you're going to get whoever's better, and competition's never a bad thing. But I do think that there's a position on this roster that still needs filled, or at the very least, you need competition for Van Jefferson, because he too, while being a guy that has formerly played for Arthur Smith, is not a guy that's overly impressive and not a guy that's going to be able to really take any attention away from George Pickens or Roman Wilson. He's not going to be a guy that's going to have a lot of attention devoted to him by opposing defenses. And I think you need to, at the very least, bring in somebody that's going to be competition for him in camp, because it's not going to be Watkins. It's not going to be Scotty Miller. So you need somebody else in that aspect. But outside of that, I'm not sure how much more they can do. The options, like you mentioned, have dwindled drastically.
Yeah, it is. You talk about it, and everybody brings up, well, everybody's got these connections with Arthur Smith. I don't know why the Pittsburgh Steelers decided this was the direction they were going to go, but the Steelers decided they go with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th best options in Arthur Smith's offense last year. There were 7 players who had better receiving numbers than Scotty Miller, who led the list above Van Jefferson, above Pratt, whatever, and above Cordero Patterson all last season. So they just went with hey, who are the worst guys out there? And it's not like the other guys weren't available. Mack Hollins was available. Mack Hollins had a decent year with the Falcons last year, 251 yards and 30 catches, played just 13 games. I mean, that's not terrible. You know, you could have brought in a Jonnu Smith who had 582 yards and 3 touchdowns. Didn't approach him. It just, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical about the way they've approached this whole situation with the, hey, we're going to bring in familiar faces. I think that's more Tomlin than anything. You know, I get the Omar Khan thing, but I think Tomlin loves to have familiar faces. He loves to have guys who understand what's going on in the locker room, who understand each other, who make the transition easier for everybody else. He used to do this a couple of years ago. I mean, you got to remember that when the Steelers back in the day had like every brother they could possibly have in the NFL, and they still have a couple of them, but they also had teammates. Anytime they signed somebody, they'd sign somebody else from the same team just to be like, okay, just to make it an easier transition. I don't think they need to do that anymore. I think they could go away from that and just say, okay. And they've done it this year. I mean, Deshaun Elliott and Patrick Queen, great example. You know, you got 2 guys who played together who are now here on the Pittsburgh Steelers and presumed starters for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think that's a Tomlin thing more than an Omar Khan thing. When I look at where they go from here, I don't think that Scotty Miller makes the roster, and I don't think he's a guy who is expected to make the roster. I think, just like you said, he's competition. The Steelers need competition. They're looking for competition. They need somebody to push everybody else to see who the best guys are. I think that they still believe a trade is possible at some point this offseason, and they just want to stack up to have enough guys to take reps during training camp before that trade happens, before they say, okay, Treylon Burks is coming to the Pittsburgh Steelers, Cortland Sutton's coming to the Pittsburgh Steelers, whoever is coming to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Before that happens, I just think they need guys to take reps. And I don't think that they want, you know, guys like Denzel Mims to be taking reps or Des Fitzpatrick to be taking a bunch of reps. They want guys who have actual playing experience, who make NFL rosters, because you could say, hey, Denzel Mims is a former 2nd-round pick. Yeah, cool. Scotty Miller still has an upper hand on that guy. Why? Because Scotty Miller makes NFL rosters. Denzel Mims doesn't. That's the difference. So I think that they're looking at it as a right now thing and not a later thing. I still expect a trade to go down, and I think these are just filler pieces before then. If they do not, you want to talk about we've talked about like, hey, everything's going to work out just fine. George Pickens, blah, blah, blah. I believe that until George Pickens gets hurt, until something happens to the Pittsburgh Steelers offense, which happens every year. I mean, Deontay went down last year. George Pickens turns into a superstar, becomes, hey, this guy could be a number one, easy. The Steelers don't have that option this year. If somebody goes down, they're left completely stranded at the wide receiver position. And it happens every year. This is the NFL. Players get hurt. They get hurt all the time. And sometimes it's freak accidents. Sometimes it's a hamstring, especially at the wide receiver position. You can't look at guys and say, we're going to bank on George being our only superstar and nobody behind him, and that's going to be okay. And I think the Steelers believe that, which is going to force their hand, which is, just to bring a full circle. I know I'm rambling, but just to bring a full circle. I think the Steelers are going to force their hand to a trade no matter what, but it might not be the guys that they thought it would be at the beginning of this, where it was Courtland Sutton, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, so on and so forth. I think the Steelers will get to a point come training camp where they will look at it and just say, who can we trade for? It doesn't matter what that name is or if that name is a superstar or not or what he's going. Who can we trade for? Who can we make a move for? And I think they will bring in somebody who has at least some upside and say, okay, at least we added somebody to this roster because we desperately needed to. I don't think it's a name we've talked about yet, unless it's Treylon Burks, but I think that they will just look at it and say, who is available? We're going to go get that guy. Crazy to think that?
No, I think that the closer you get to training camp, like you mentioned, the depth is just, you have a lot of names, but you don't have a lot of high quality names. So that depth is concerning. And I think that, like you mentioned, you're one injury away. And a lot of these players might be being brought in to learn the offense or to get used to and familiar with the quarterback, because as Omar Khan said last year, as Mike Tomlin said last year, we like to bring in some veterans for the practice squad in the, instance, in case of some of those injuries. You have veterans there. You don't have to rely on rookies and young guys. So perhaps that's what they're doing. But I think that the later it gets into this summer, if there's no other options, I think that they'd get more willing to open up what they would offer to get another player in. So to that aspect, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, I just look at I think that they have a plan now. They have a plan long term. I don't think anything's worked out in their favor right now. And I just, to be honest, I also think that the Steelers had a plan when it came to San Francisco, that they wanted Brandon Ayuk. I think that one was real. I think once that kind of fell apart, they didn't have a backup plan. I think the media created all the backup plans. I think we all talked about the Courtland Suttons and the Deebo Samuel and the DK Metcalf. I think that was all us. I think that was all just, hey, this name makes sense. Let's talk about this name now. And I think the Steelers are still figuring out their backup plan. Like, I think that that's a real thing, because there's like, I've seen like one report saying the Denver Broncos turned down an offer from the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I didn't believe that report. I believe certain reports. I don't believe others. The DK Metcalf called about DK Metcalf. I don't believe that for the life of me. There's no part of me that believes the Pittsburgh Steelers called the Seattle Seahawks before June 1st and said, hey, are you interested in trading DK Metcalf? I don't believe that for a second. I believe the Brandon Ayuk stuff. And I believe that was their plan A, and they thought that they were going to be able to do it, and it didn't happen. So now they're sitting here and waiting for option 2 to come around, and I think it will come around. And I think they'll find themselves in a position where they make a move, and it won't be a big splashy name, but it'll be a name that comes through and that makes some sense. And to be honest, there are teams out there. I mean, look at the Denver Broncos, dude. You could go get Tim Patrick. You could go get little Jordan Humphreys. They're not splashy names, but they started last season for the Broncos. They have starting experience. They have familiarity with Russell Wilson. They're going to go for absolutely nothing, and they're both on one-year deals. That's a good fit for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I just think that there are a bunch of options out there that make sense, and we will see something at some point. I do very much so believe.